We have 20 people already waiting to get in. So we're recording. So hi, everyone. We're not starting yet, but so glad to see you, happy to be here. That's from Mike Hollander to Jody. We're really excited to have everyone here for the first of a series of 4 fantastic, what we call them, lectures, Mike?
Presentations. I call them virtual journeys.
Virtual journeys. I'm excited, except the only thing we're not going to be able to do is eat the food.
Yeah, well, I did a seminar last week on Machane Yehuda, kind of a tasting tour through Machane Yehuda, and I asked 2 different people. One guy who owns a Turkish kind of Middle Eastern restaurant, Azura, and the other who's a spice monger. And I said, so can you tell me the difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi cuisine? And they both laughed. So one guy said, well, let's just say that Sephardic cuisine has a lot of spice and Ashkenazi cuisine is anemic. So I don't know where we fall out on that axis, but no question. Ashkenazi food.
Well, the thing about Israel is they combine so many cuisines to make the most delicious flavors that, I mean, the food is so divine there. I mean, it used to be horrible. The first time I went to Israel was 1968. You can imagine what, you know, it was a long time.
Did you bring your own cans of tuna fish?
No. I went to Tel Aviv University for a year.
Wow.
And so, no, I lived like an Israeli. I mean, I learned to live like an Israeli. I'd never had hummus in my life or any of that food, but, you know, it was one of the best years of my life for sure. And I reflect now, Israel was only 20 years old when I went there. And it was really something. You had to wait 3 years to get a telephone.
Yep. And now I think we have some of the highest penetration of cell phones in the world.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it was so different. It was great though. I loved it. Okay, this is odd. Wait, I should look at this chat. What does it say? I only see 2 of you, Susan and Mike. That's right. Nobody is seeing anyone else. This is a webinar. It's not a Zoom where we're all seeing each other. It's more of a lecture, a presentation. And then we'll have questions in the chat because a lot of the presentation is in PowerPoint. So we wouldn't see each other anyway. I'm going to be off as well after I introduce Mike. So it's not a Zoom, it's a webinar because there's no reason to see each other right now. Okay, great. So right now, how many people? We have 26 people. So no, that's not what we have. How many do we have? Panel 39?
39 so far.
Coming in. Good morning, everyone. We're waiting for you to join us. We're just having a little off the cuff chat about Israel. I'm with Mike Hollander.
Hello.
Where is Mike speaking from?
I'm speaking from the little town of Modi'in. You might have heard of it around Hanukkah time. It's a brand new. In this part of the world, 20 years is brand new. It's a city that was the first planned city in about 60 years in Israel, located right between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, home of the Maccabees. And today it's a city of about 100,000 people. I like to say it's Middle Israel because geographically it is smack in the center of the 2 big urban centers, but it's also very Middle Israel in that it's very middle class. There's no freestanding homes here, which means that, you know, upper middle class would want to live in a place where they can have a villa with a swimming pool. There's very little poverty, a lot of academics here, a lot of career officers in the military, a lot of people who work for the government because we're close to Jerusalem, a lot of people who work in the private sector because we're close to Tel Aviv. So it's smack in the middle of the country, and I'm talking to you from my office as we speak.
So he's from Israel. Tony Schulman has a question. Okay, to me privately. Okay, well, I don't see the question. Right now we have how many participants? 57. Okay, it's only 9:31. Jewish time, we'll probably start around 9:33 or 4.
Tell me, Rabbi, the fires aren't near you guys, are they? They're further kind of south?
They're close enough that there's ash on my car.
Oh, wow.
And the air quality is bad today. So
Well, I mean,
they're not like, you can't see it, but it's affecting us, sadly.
Jody keeps writing to me. Yes, they are, Jody. I'll introduce myself, Jody. My kids are grown up.
Okay. So let's see how many we have now. 58. We're still at 58. We're going to start in about 2 minutes. We'll start in 2 minutes. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Or maybe people are having trouble getting on. I don't know. It shouldn't be. So what time is it in Israel right now?
It is now 6:30. We fell backwards on Saturday night, Sunday morning.
Oh, that's a decent hour.
Yeah, it's very, and I'm surprised. I guess everybody's finished their yoga and their breakfast and they're ready to go on a virtual visual journey.
Don't forget, we're stuck at home. No, nothing's open.
Is there a lockdown in all of California?
I'll lock it down, but there's
restaurants are open, or
you eat outside. You can eat outside. I mean, I guess some people eat inside, but most don't. People are still taking out and keeping their distance. Certainly older people are staying at home most of the time. We've been home for months. No Jews.
Has preschool started yet in the synagogue?
There's preschool, but there's a day school. The day school is all online.
Wow.
Nobody, just the preschool's the only one. Risa David's asking, how's the train running? What does that mean?
It's good. Running, but it's in Israel. I guess it has to be Israel because I don't think there is a train in LA. There is, but it's not a commuter train. It's running. It's running with a lot fewer people on it. Last week Israel went out of our very harsh, month-long period of lockdown, our second major lockdown. It was shorter and was more liberal than the first lockdown we had in the spring. And the train, people were still working throughout that period. And the train was running, but at a much limited schedule and with fewer passengers on it. The airport is running as well, and there are people flying, friends flying to San Francisco in a couple of days' time. There's a lot more coming and going than there was a few months ago, which is good. Israelis are able to go to certain countries in Europe and not have to come back to be quarantined. But if you go to other countries, you do have to come back to be quarantined. So it's definitely different now than it was a couple months ago, which is good.
So it's 9:34 and we're going to begin. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first of 4 wonderful presentations by Mike Hollander on European journeys. We're very excited. This first one is going to be about Poland, and Mike's going to introduce it as well. But Mike is an educator and a tour guide of both Israel and Europe. And he has been doing this for how many years? 20 years, Mike?
Going to Europe? Yeah, over 20 years now.
He's originally from Canada, from Vancouver.
Yeah.
And he moved to Israel quite a while ago. And we're very excited. Jody Berman, one of our assistant executive directors, recommended him. She knows him well, and I think it was a great recommendation. So Mike, I'm just gonna, what we're gonna do is Mike's gonna give his presentation, and then at the end, we're gonna allow time for people to put in, type in some questions if you have any, or if there's something relevant to the moment, and you can type it in, and if Mike can get to it, he will. So Mike, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Shalom, good evening. I'm guessing that most of you, like me, have not gotten on an airplane, probably since about March. I, as Rabbi Nana said, made Aliyah from Vancouver, Canada, about 32 years ago. I have married a woman from New York, and we have 3 children. It's hard to say they're children because my eldest is 28 and married, and my middle is 25 and probably soon to be married, and our youngest is still got a year of a 4-year military commitment. He's 22. So I'm an Israeli by choice, as is my wife, Michelle, and our kids are all Israeli by birth and Canadian through me, of course, and American through my wife. But I've really been involved in Jewish education for most of my life. And since I've been in Israel, really the past 30 almost years, I've been working as a tour guide in the country. And then really almost 20 years, a little bit more now, I started taking Jewish groups to Europe. And when lockdown began and Corona started to spread, and I had a couple groups scheduled in the spring, I was basically from about March until now, I should have been in Europe, I think 3 or 4 times, in Amsterdam and in Poland and in Germany and in Lithuania and the Ukraine. And all of those, unfortunately, were canceled. And then I started to pivot and say, what can I do as an educator who's used to working in the field in Israel or in Europe? How can I kind of teach without being there? I mean, there's kind of no point. And then this new thing that I'd never heard of called Zoom came along, and I said, here we go. And my challenge has been to kind of create a virtual visual journey to take people from the comfort of their living room or their study or wherever they are, because they can't get out, and to go and to explore. But I think this notion of travel is something that is inherent in our Jewish DNA. And the story doesn't begin actually today in Poland or in the coming weeks. I think we're going to Russia together and to Spain and to Berlin, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi.
Yes.
But it actually begins with Avram, the first, again, Jew by choice, if you want to call it that, person who takes up the message. And I thought earlier this afternoon, because it's now 6:30 my time in the evening, that, well, Avraham really comes onto the scene last weekend, the end of the Parsha of Noach. And it's this week that is Lech Lecha, which is my favorite biblical portion, because it talks about how God tells Abraham to go to the land. Lech lecha le'artzecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetcha le'eretz asher erecha. Go from the land of your birth, the land that you're familiar with, the place that you grew up in, and go to the place that I will show you. And of course, Abraham, as the first iconoclast, he literally and figuratively broke the images and shattered, the world in which he grew up, the world of paganism. But Abraham comes to the land, and of course, we learn so many commentaries throughout the millennia. And if I'm letting in any secret that you, Rabbi, or anybody else is going to talk on Shabbat, then you'll have to reinvent your Dvar Torah before then. But the notion of Lech Lecha is in many ways seen mystically as going unto yourself, making a journey, going from point A to point B, going from Haran, the city where Avraham and his family had been after they left Ur in Mesopotamia, to the land of Canaan. And something happens to you. There's some spiritual component to that physical journey that you're taking. In other words, you don't just get on your plane at LAX and land with the new flights when they come back again, El Al, and land in Ben Gurion. Something happens to you spiritually and mystically, not just physically. And then later on in this parsha is the story of how God tells Avraham, he says, Kum v'hitalech ba'aretz le'orka ve'le'rochba. Arise and walk the land, its length and its breadth, ki lecha etnena, because I will give it to you. He says, he goes to the sea, to the west, he goes to the east Kedma, he goes to the north to the Galilee, and he goes to the south to the Negev. But in the language of the Hebrew Bible, for those who are a little bit more familiar with Hebrew, the verb in Hebrew is lalechet. So God should have said, go and walk the land. Kum v'telech ba'aretz. Go and walk the land, but he doesn't. The biblical author uses the word hitalech, which is a reflexive verb. And the reflexive tense, like in French and Spanish and other languages, some of you might be familiar with, as well as Hebrew, is a deeper level of meaning. So when God tells Avram to hitalech ba'aretz, he says to Avram, walk the land, you will touch the land, you'll impact the land, but the land will also have an impact on you. There's a reciprocity to that notion of journey, and I think that is inherent to Judaism. And of all the weeks in the year, this is one of the 54 where it turns out I'm starting a series of 4 travel journeys with you, most of whom I've never met, probably all of whom I've never met except for Jody. And voila, here we are at that very story that Jews all over the world are going to be sharing on Shabbat, the same story of how Avraham was the first journeyman. And with that, I'm going to take you to Poland. I don't know how many of you have been to Poland. I've been to Poland now many, many times, probably about 40 or 50 times in the past 25 years or so. And I think I chose Poland and the story of 1,000 years. I'm way ahead of my presentation, sorry guys. 1,000 years of life in Poland, because I'm guessing the vast majority of people in this conversation are people whose families, as both Jessica and Rabbi Nanis and I were talking about, and my 4 grandparents as well, came from Eastern Europe sometime between about 1880 and a little bit after the First World War, early 1920s. The vast majority of American Jewry was part of this immigration wave of 2 to 2.5 million people. And there's no question that Poland was probably the center, definitely the largest number of people by 1939, number of Jews in that part of the world. And Warsaw was the second biggest Jewish populated city in the world at that time. And in the next hour or so, I'm going to visit 3 places: the city of Warsaw, the capital of contemporary Poland, the city of Krakow, the capital of medieval Poland, and the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, unfortunately, which we're not going to actually end with. We're going to come back to Krakow just for the end. But I think in order to really understand Poland, and I will extend this to the other places that we're going to go, although it's not exactly 1,000 years. And I'm talking about, again, Russia and Berlin and Spain. And each of those places has a different Jewish story, but there are some common themes. So when I travel to Europe and I have my opening session with my group from a synagogue somewhere usually in North America, and I talk about the need to change the lens through which we approach what we're going to be experiencing, right? Abraham went on a journey from Ur to Haran, from Haran to Canaan, and he had a different experience because he was in a different place. And I'm going to encourage you to do that virtually here, and hopefully when we have the opportunity on the ground, if we ever get the chance to visit someplace in Europe or in Israel together. And you need to switch your glasses. I'm an Israeli by choice. You're American. Some of you might be Israeli born. I don't know. But you need to have a different set of lenses through which to see and experience Jewish Europe. And the first lens in Poland is a lens of 1,000 years of Jewish life. There were good times, there were bad times, but that's 1,000 years. To try in an hour to talk about that and 2 other themes is very difficult. To visit Poland and Warsaw and to go to this museum, this structure there, which is a less than 10-year-old museum called Polin, the history of 1,000 years of Jewish life in Poland, and have a 2 or 3 hour visit is pretty much most humans can only kind of withstand 2 to 3 hours in a museum. But to try to grapple with 1,000 years of rich Jewish life on the one hand. On the other hand, or the second side of this prism, is the Shoah. In Poland from September 1st, 1939 until the spring, summer of 1945. And I think for most groups that I have guided in Poland, and I'm talking probably 24 by now, for them, the reason to come to Poland is because of the Shoah. To say Kaddish for the relative that you never met, your parents or grandparents' relative perhaps. But I think tragically, much of Jewish travel to Europe is seen exclusively through that angle. And I want to encourage you in our sessions together to go beyond that, to look at the rich Jewish life that preceded 1933 in Germany or 39 in Poland, to look at the Shoah, but also to look at the third side of the triangle from 1945 to the present. And I think that's the most difficult and complicated. And in some places, I'll spend more time on it, and other places, I'll spend less time. In Russia, for example, I'll spend a lot more time talking about that period than the Shoah, because the Shoah didn't really happen on what we call the state or the country of Russia today. And in Spain, I'm not going to talk about the Shoah either. I'm not going to talk about 1945 to the present. But I think 3 different periods: period of a long period, hundreds of years of Jewish life there, a tragedy, the expulsion in Spain in 1492, the Shoah, and the challenge of life since 1945 to the present. So if you look at this and break down this kind of 3-sided prism, the first, as I mentioned, is 1,000 years of Jewish experience. There were good times, I mean, very good times. Unbelievable Jewish creativity times. In the 16th century was perhaps the second golden age that Jews experienced in Europe. We all talk about Spain, but few people are aware that the 16th century in Krakow was an unbelievable period of Jewish creativity. Bad times, not just the Shoah, but the Khmelnytsky pogroms in the mid-17th century, in which tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered. How Jews were invited into certain places in Europe, but then were kicked out. Periods of unbelievable creativity, but also periods of perhaps forced insularity because of the tension that we face from society around us. The second period, the Shoah, as I said, very short, barely a little bit over 6 years in Poland. After the kind of signing in August of 1939 of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of non-aggression, Germany invades Poland from the west. Russia, or Soviet Union, I should say, invades Poland from the east, and they kind of rip apart Poland for the umpteenth time. And then Poland is occupied. And then we will talk more about the Shoah, of course. And then the third side of that prism, from 1945 to the present, as I mentioned before, perhaps the most difficult and the most complicated period. Questions of, can you even live in a country where 10% of the population, 3.25 million people, Jews, lived. And today you can count on one or two hands how many thousands of Jews live in Poland. How do you live there? Is there anti-Semitism there? What about the relationship between Poland as an independent country post-Glasnost and post-fall of the Iron Curtain and the state of Israel? These are very deep and very difficult questions, which I'll hopefully have a chance to raise at the end. I can't guarantee I'll answer them because they're very difficult and we don't have that much time. But these, I think, are some of the most important questions that one needs to ask as we take our journey to Poland. Why am I stuck on the slide? I don't know why, but whatever. How did we get to Poland? I mean, we know the Bible and where it all begins, Abraham and Egypt and back to the land of Canaan, but how did we get to Poland? There's a tale that is told, and it was put down 100 years ago by Shai Agnon, the only Israeli to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. He won it in 1966. And Shai Agnon tries to describe how the Jews got to Poland. We didn't know, but our fathers, and I'm reading now, our fathers told us how the exiles of Israel came to the land of Poland. When Israel saw how its sufferings were constantly renewed, oppression increased, persecutions multiplied, and how the evil authorities piled decree upon decree and followed expulsion with expulsion, so there was no way to escape the enemies of Israel, they went out on the road. This sounds familiar. We've done this so many times in our history, and sought an answer on the paths of the wide world. Which is the correct road to traverse to find rest for the soul? Then a piece of paper fell from heaven, and on it the words, "Go to Polania," Poland. So they came to the land of Poland, and they gave a mountain of gold to the king, and he received them with great honor. And God had mercy on them, so they found new favor with the king and the nobles. And the king gave them permission to reside in all the lands of his kingdom, to trade over its length and breadth, and to serve God according to the precepts of their religion. And the king protected them against every foe and enemy. And Israel lived in Poland in tranquility for a long time. They devoted themselves to trade and handicrafts, and God sent a blessing on them, so they were blessed in the land. And their name was exalted among the peoples. And they traded with these surrounding countries, and they also struck coins of the inscriptions in the holy language and the language of the country. Sounds almost like a place that many of you are familiar with, America today. Germany until 1933, Spain until 1492. We were very important to the fabric of society, or at least certain sectors of society back then in Poland, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. These are the coins, etc. When they came from the land of the Franks, Germany. Now, why did Jews leave Germany? When the Crusades started, the depth of the Dark Ages in Europe, toward the end of the 11th century, when Pope Urbain II issues his call at Clermont to go and take back the Christian holy places from the lands of the Muslims, they swept across Europe and they devastated European communities in an area called Ashkenaz. Now, most of us are Ashkenazi. And we say that's because we originate from Eastern Europe. Well, Ashkenaz, geographically, to be perfectly intellectually honest today, is the area of the border between France and Germany along the Rhine Valley. From Frankfurt, kind of draw a line down towards Switzerland. That is city of Worms, the city of Mainz, the city of Speyer. That was the center. Rashi, 11th, 12th century, and then we were kicked out from there and we went eastward. So when we said we left the land of the Franks, we went from Germany to Poland, and Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. They found wood in the land, and every tree, there was one tractate of the Talmud. This is the forest, which is near Lublin. And every man said to his neighbor, "We have come to the land where ancestors dwelt before the Torah and revelation was granted. And those who seek, for names say, this is why it is called Poland. For thus spoke Israel when they came to the land. Here, rest for the night. Po, here, lin is to rest. So it's an acronym of these two words, here, rest, or rest here. And this means that we shall rest here until we are gathered into the land of Israel. Since this is our tradition, we accept it as such. Shai Agnon, 1916. It's an amazing story. It's a legend. Did it happen? Did it not happen? But it's a story that Jews would tell ourselves for hundreds of years in Poland to try to explain how we got to this incredible place, right? So it's a good story. It sounds pretty good. It sounds as if we are treated very, very favorably by the people. I'm getting stuck here. By the people in the country of Poland. Where did we come from? You can see on the map over here. I said a number of us ended up coming from this area. See my arrow here, the Rhineland. This area along here. Mainz and Speyer and Worms, the three cities, Shum cities I mentioned before. We went east. Look at the years eastward. Because although the church largely, and the governments, shall I say, the kings and the queens in that part of the world exiled us. Others in Eastern Europe welcomed us. And that's the history of, as the rabbi and I were talking about before, that's the history of the Jewish people, going from one place to the other, welcomed and kicked out, the kind of ups and downs of 1,000 years of Jewish life in Europe. As I said here before, we talk about Ashkenaz, the area of Lithuania and Russia, from the year about 1000 to 1500. And I do want to say, just as we need to put our lenses on to understand the Jewish experience, different lenses to a different set of glasses, so too must we look at the geography of Europe differently. Because Europe, as we know it today, is different than it was up until 1990, for example, which is different than it was up until 1945, which is different than what it looked before and a little bit after the First World War. So we talk about Poland. Today, it's different than the Poland through hundreds and hundreds of years, as I mentioned beforehand. But this is the area where I'm guessing most of us actually come from, the area of Galicia, southern Poland, kind of a little bit of Ukraine over on this side, Belarusia kind of up over here, Austria down over here. Some of us are Galicianers. Others of us are Litvaks, Lithuanians, who come from this area over here. As I mentioned, I've got one grandparent from contemporary Poland. Although the truth of the matter is, I went from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Lithuania. And I never met my two grandfathers, but my two grandmothers, for all I knew, the Ukraine that they came from would have been Poland, and the Poland they came from might have been Lithuania, depending on the years that they emigrated, like all of us. So we say Ashkenaz, again, it's not the original Ashkenaz, but it's the area of Eastern Europe, Poland, Russia, Lithuania, Belarus, et cetera, et cetera. When one goes to Warsaw, perhaps the most significant site that one sees in the city of Warsaw is this new museum, voted a couple of years ago the best new museum in Europe, actually, called Polin, from the word Polin. It's 1,000 years of Jewish life in Europe. And this structure that you see is the backside of a memorial, you'll see it in a couple slides, that is put up on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on April 19th, 1948, and ended in began in 1943, and on the 5th anniversary of the beginning of the uprising, on the 19th of April 1948, the Polish government on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto built this memorial. You see the backside called the Last March, and in many ways, this image has been there since 1948, and even under the communist era, it was a place where every April 19th, not the Jewish Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Heroism and Memorial Day, but the Polish National Day of Remembrance of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Prime Minister would come, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army would come. Poland saw it as a Polish national site of remembrance. And on the other side of it is the heroic side, and the back side, which we see over here, is, and you'll see it closer, and as I said in a minute, is the site of the Last March. This new museum attempts to change the story that is told on that site, and that is, it's not just a place where Jews fought to their death, but it's also a place where Jews lived with their lives for 1,000 years. Very, very important. So if we were to put a balance sheet up there, and again, I'm not an accountant, I'm a Jewish educator, and we were to say, was it good or was it bad? You'd say, yeah, well, it's pretty clear that Europe was the center of the Ashkenazi world, and really the Jewish world up until 1939. And Poland was its greatest center, and Warsaw was at its epicenter. It had a city of 1 million people, a third of whom were Jewish, the second largest Jewish community in the world after New York City. It was an amazing center of creativity, diverse in so many fields, literature, science, arts, politics, Zionist movements, you name it. I mean, if you look at the Knesset today, outside of the Arab parties, they're basically descendants of political ideas that were in Poland until 1939. Look at Hollywood actors today, and whether it's Danny Kaye, whose aunt Ida Kaminsky was the founder of Yiddish theater, all the way through to literature and Isaac Bashevis Singer. All of these are people coming from Poland really before 1939. And as I say, it was the epicenter of the anvil of Jewish creativity for half a century before the Second World War. It's important to remember that just as there were rich Jews, there were poor Jews. They were devout and agnostic. They were literate and illiterate. There were Hasidim and Misnagdim, those opposed to Hasidism. Zionist and Bundist and the ultra-Orthodox Agudat Yisrael. Some were really integrated into Polish society. They even assimilated. Others were far away from Polish society, and they lived a very diverse and colorful life. And I want to share with you a video from a movie, which is also based on a book, about a group of people called the Oneg Shabbat, only a short period for about 2 years in the Warsaw Ghetto, from 40 to 43, led by Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian, with the Jewish Historical Institute, who collected thousands and thousands of documents. And it's a very powerful book because it sheds light on the life that was inside the Warsaw Ghetto, from secular and ultra-Orthodox and everything in between, Zionist and Bundist perspectives. But this short little 2-minute clip, I think, will give you a bit of a perspective on the diversity of Jewish life that was in Warsaw.
When I came to Warsaw for the first time in the early 1930s, I was astonished at the intensity of Jewish life. Such a multitude of Jews I had never seen. Pious Jews in black gabardines. Jews who were rabbis, teachers who wanted to transform our earthly life into a long study of Torah and prayer to God. And still other Jews, broad-shouldered, deep-voiced. Jews who with a blow of their fists could floor any hooligan who dared enter into their neighborhoods.
Rachel Auerbach belongs to the first generation of Polish Jews who got a higher education. She became a journalist and a leading member of the Yiddish-Polish intelligentsia.
She was a literary art and film critic. She wrote about women's literature, but also about position of women in contemporary society. She emphasized the double exclusion Jewish women were experiencing as women and as Jews.
In Warsaw, there were 6 Yiddish daily papers and 2 dailies in the Polish language. There were 2 steady Yiddish theaters and many traveling troupes. The Yiddish Literary and Journalist Union had 400 members. This Jewry had about 100 modern Jewish schools in Warsaw alone. A state within a state, the Polish anti-Semites screamed. And there was slight truth in that, especially culturally.
So I like showing that movie because to me it's imperative that people see and understand the depth and the breadth of Jewish life that was. Sorry, I don't want that again. Sorry about that, guys. Because, as I said, for most people who come to Poland, their sense, there we go, their sense of Jewish life in Poland is based on the Shoah. And if all you see when you're in Poland is the Shoah, then you're missing, as I said, the point of 1,000 years of Jewish life that preceded the Shoah and the complex questions of Jewish life since the end of the Second World War in 1945. So the diversity of Jewish life, read Isaac Bashevis Singer book. I don't have enough time in an hour to do it. And there's some beautiful scenes from The Family Muscat and other novels of the rich, diverse life that was. And try to imagine New York City at about the same time. You know, the affluent Jews living in the upper West Side or East Side at that time, maybe the new immigrants settled in the Lower East Side. And I'm sure it's a story that resonates deeply with many of you because that's where your family came from. And think about it, 6 daily papers in Yiddish and 2 in Polish in the Jewish community, 100 Jewish schools. I don't know what LA's population is, maybe similar to 350,000, but it gives you a sense of the richness of Jewish life that was. How do you understand this? Maybe, and I'm borrowing from some, I forget his name, some British writer from years ago, and it wasn't J.K. Rowling, who wrote a book called The Tale of Two Cities. And in this, I'm going to compare 2 synagogues. The great synagogue on Tolmaki Street, which in its destruction in May of 43 symbolized the squelching and the end of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and the Nozik Synagogue, the only synagogue that survived in Warsaw of 400 synagogues, and it is today used as a synagogue, the Nozik, that is the active synagogue of the Orthodox rabbinate today, kind of the center of Jewish life. The first one, inaugurated late 19th century, could seat 3,000 people. I don't want to say it was a reformed synagogue, it was a reformed synagogue, in that they had music and they had choir, and they had separate seating for men and women, of course, but the sermon was often given in German, depending on then this was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Parts of Poland, definitely in Krakow. So sermon was given in lingua franca, and it kind of symbolized the liberalism, not the reform or conservative movements per se in Eastern Europe. It was more felt in Germany, the emergence of reform and conservative Judaism, but it was a more liberal synagogue versus the Nozick synagogue, which was a traditional synagogue. I mentioned it survived miraculously because it was used as a storage facility by the Germans. Look at the Tomaki synagogue. This is it on the right-hand side. It is enormous. It is right in downtown Warsaw. You got a beautiful Magen David, a Star of David on the top. You've got a beautiful menorah on the left. You can see it over there with my arrow. The other one's hidden by the tree. Fantastic kind of classic architectural style building of a community that A, has the resources, and B, is proud of who it is, adorning, and look at how much higher it is than the skyline of Warsaw all around it. It was destroyed in May, but this building to the left, the Jewish Historical Institute, is still there, and that building houses the archive, over 20,000. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Documents by the Oneg Shabbat that the woman in the movie, Rachel Auerbach, was a part of, led by Emmanuel Ringelblum. They were buried and they were discovered in milk crates afterwards. It's a bit of an aside, but a beautiful place to visit today. Today, there's an office building where the synagogue used to be. The Nozick synagogue, on the other hand, you can see is a beautiful, visitable synagogue. It's, as I say, where Michael Shudrock, the American-born chief rabbi of Poland, sits. It is an Orthodox synagogue. There's an Ezrat Nashim, the women's section, above here and above there. But I don't remember this last picture. Yeah, you can see it here a little bit better. On the ground level, there's a mechitza separating between the men and women because they don't usually have a full synagogue, but it's an active synagogue. There's a mikveh there. There's a kosher place to get kosher food. There's a school. Everything that one would expect in terms of life cycle events happen in the Jewish community take place there. There is also a reform and conservative presence in Warsaw as well, but they are not in synagogue buildings that survived from before the war. They're oftentimes in rented facilities. The best place, therefore, if there's only one synagogue left, to understand the depth and breadth and richness of Jewish life that was before 1939 is in a cemetery. Why do we go? And almost every Jewish trip that I have, whether it's in Poland, less so in Spain because there aren't any left really, you go to visit a cemetery. And the 19th century, early 19th century Gentya Cemetery, which really functioned from about 1806 until 1939, and it still functions, is the place to grapple with the richness of Jewish life. We have many words in Hebrew for cemetery. We have Beit Kfarot, the house of tombs. We have also Beit HaChaim or Gan HaChaim, the place of the garden of life. We have Beit HaAlmin, which comes from the Hebrew word for eternity. And this picture that one of my tours took in February, actually, in Frankfurt, in the Jewish cemetery, you can see Beit HaChaim, a very old, one of the oldest in Europe, actually, cemetery, the house of life, because it's there that one goes to see, not the people, but one goes to see the story of the people as inscribed on the tombstones, which we'll see in just a minute. But those of you who haven't met me, and that's almost all of you, you know that my guru for Jewish travel is the late Israeli national poet Yehuda Amichai, who wrote many books, his last of which was Open, Closed, Open, which was published, I think, in English just after his death. He died in September of 2000, so 20 years ago. And he writes a beautiful poem in the context of Jewish travel about the Warsaw Cemetery. Seeking roots in the Warsaw Cemetery, here it is the roots that are seeking. They burst from the ground, overturn gravestones, and clasp the broken fragments in search of names and dates, in search of what was and what will never be again. The roots are seeking their trees that were burned to the ground. Very, very powerful images, which when I show you some pictures I've taken from my phone mostly, in my many, many trips there, you'll see where it says there, Evel M, the loss of the mourning of the mother. And there, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's an acrostic, right? It says the name of the deceased, the first name, letter of her name is on the right-hand side of the cemetery. And remember the imagery of Amichai, what does he say? The roots are seeking their trees, right? The roots were seeking, they burst from the ground and overturned gravestones. He wrote that because he visited this incredible cemetery where there are about 350,000 Jews buried, about 250,000 regular burials, and about 100,000 in tombs, collective tombs, where Jews were buried during the time of the Shoah. as I mentioned. Some very famous personages are buried there. The three kind of fathers of Yiddish literature, Peretz Ansky, as in the Dybbuk Ansky, Yaakov Dinizon, Ludwig Zamenhof. Many of you have never heard of him. He was a Bialystok-born Jewish ophthalmologist who invented a language called Esperanto out of his despair and the babble of conversation and argument and nationalism and tension in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he said, listen, if we can all speak a common language, we can understand each other. And he invented this language of Esperanto out of the Latin root esper, to hope. Meir Balaban, he was the director and the founder, really, of the Jewish Historical Institute, out of which Rachel Auerbach and the other people started this group called the Oneg Shabbat, preserving, thankfully, what was going on in life inside the Warsaw Ghetto, because Jewish history was a relatively new phenomenon. Only really starts to talk about Jewish history and not Jewish memory in the theological context in the 19th century. And Balaban was inspired by this idea and founded this institute. Adam Chernyakov, the head of the Judenrat, who took his life in the summer of 1943, rather than continue to send the Jews out to be murdered in 1942, to be murdered in Treblinka. Marek Edelman. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Marek Edelman, and please say so inside the chat. But Marek Edelman was number 2 in charge of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Most of us have heard, or many of us, I should say, have heard of Mordechai Anilevich, the 22-year-old leader of a youth movement, Hashomer Tzair, who led the Warsaw Ghetto, takes his life. There's a kibbutz named after him in Israel, Yad Mordechai. There was even a book Leon Uris wrote, right, about Mila 18, which was the address of the command bunker in which the leadership lived and ultimately took their lives. But one of the leaders, number 2 in charge, Marek Edelman, survived. And he fled the Warsaw Ghetto, went to the Polish side of Warsaw and fought with the Polish national resistance in the summer of 1944, survived and continued to live in Warsaw till he died about a decade ago. Very prominent Jewish doctor. Most people have never heard of him because he didn't read what he should have read, and he never made it to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel. Rather, he's lying inside, rather than he is lying inside the cemetery in Warsaw. Crazy story. This story also, now my screen gets stuck again. Sorry, of who's next? Many prominent rabbis, 5 Orthodox people visiting. They want to visit. The founder of the Soloveitchik dynasty is buried there, and they go to the Oholei Tzadikim, the tents of the righteous that are built, these big structures built over the tombs of the rabbis. And as I said, there's also a mass grave of 100,000 Jews who were murdered there in the Shoah, and it is still used. I was there once in the spring, and it was the day in which Poles go to visit their beloved ones in the cemeteries, and Jews did the same thing. It was amazing. That it was just the Catholic cemeteries, but it was the Jewish cemeteries as well. It wasn't a yahrzeit, wasn't an official Memorial Day. It was the day that the society in which you live makes a visit there. That's me in the red. 2 years ago, I want to say, in front of the tomb of Ludwig Zamenhof, there is, it says underneath, the founder of Esperanto, beautiful tomb. Members of the Esperanto Society from all over the world come to visit him and to pay respect to this amazing idea. And there you can see me again in red, standing in front of some amazingly preserved tombstones. And a lot of people are saying, Mike, I thought the Germans destroyed everything. The Nazis destroyed everything. Not necessarily. In some cases, there was destruction. Other cases, there was not. And the reason the Warsaw Ghetto was never destroyed was because it kept functioning, the cemetery, as a cemetery. 100,000 people died from the closing of the Warsaw Ghetto in the end of October, beginning of November of 40 until 42. 100,000 people died. And at 42, then they were sent out to be murdered in Treblinka. So the Nazis were very scared of disease. They didn't want it to spread. They'd rather Jews still bury themselves in mass graves in the cemetery. I was there in the fall a couple years ago. Beautiful sense of how does a community of a few thousand Jews today maintain a cemetery of 250,000? Huge, huge challenge. And one of my favorite pictures here, you can see it says Pei Nun in Hebrew. Here lies, and again, Ha'isha Hatznoah, the modest woman, Chashuva v'yekara, very important and dear, to her family. And above it, you see the broken candlesticks. Can you see that? I'm circling around it. On the left here, you can see somebody putting coins into a tzedakah box. Maybe you can see a series of books back over there. A sense of who the people were in life, because each of these tombstones, each of these matzevot had somebody there when the person died and was buried. And they didn't know about the Shoah because they died before 1939. Perhaps the most famous person commemorated there, but not buried there, because he was murdered in Treblinka, was Janusz Korczak, a prominent Jewish educator and physician. You might have come across his book his biography by Betty Jean Lifton, King of Children. I call him the Dr. Seuss and Dr. Spock of Polish society because he was. He wrote books for children, Dr. Seuss, and for us adults, how to raise a child. And for the entire period of the ghetto, he struggled to maintain human dignity in life in the ghetto and ultimately led his children to be buried in Treblinka. And in many ways, I think a trip to Poland is not just about saying Kaddish for Dr. Korczak and his children, but from remembering his rich legacy and understanding how that legacy continues to impact humanity, and not just how he was murdered. Because if you Google Janusz Korczak, you'll come up there with Piaget and other prominent educators to try to understand how one understands a child through his or her world rather than through our adult perspective of judging of children. And as such, as I say, a visit there is not just about the murder, but it's about the life that was. Warsaw Ghetto, I mentioned the famous uprising. I don't have too much time to go into these two pictures, but this is from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial. On the left, you see the, quote, heroic imagery of the last, the ghetto fighters, right? Someone despairing down below. Maybe it's Anilevich himself in the middle with the Molotov cocktail in his hand, versus the last march on the back. In Jerusalem, they're next to each other. In Warsaw, the one on the left that you see the uprising is in the front, and most people see only that and don't even notice the small piece I showed you in the picture and the first picture of the backside of the last march, which is clearly a universal story of Judaism, of exiles and exoduses from Egypt to Spain to Poland. But if it wasn't, I don't know if you can see it, but the helmets of the Nazis over there and their bayonets there, and there you can make them out as well. The Jewish artist Nathan Rappaport wanted to kind of dehumanize the German soldiers, they dehumanized the Jews, okay? This is there as well. And again, that's what a lot of people come to see, just that story. To give you a sense of why there is nothing there, this picture taken shortly after the war shows you the almost complete destruction of the city of Warsaw. Not just in the spring of 43 from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but the next summer, 250,000 Poles were killed by the Germans in the Polish National Uprising, and that was what's left of the city. So there's nothing there, that one synagogue that I mentioned, and the cemetery. If one looks at Poland today, since, well, I guess really since the Second World War, it's an independent country, though only since the late 1980s, you'll see there's the big city of Warsaw. It's a country of about 33, 35 million people today. We're going to leave Warsaw now. We're going to take the train about 2.5 hours to get down to the city of Krakow over there. Auschwitz-Birkenau is a city somewhere just about on the border, not too far from the border of the Czech Republic today, but kind of just in the southwestern corner of Poland. It's a big country, and as I said, up until 39, it was 10% Jewish. To put it in context, that's 5 times as many Jews as there are in America today. And our journey is going to take us from 2 cities, from Warsaw, which in the late 19th, early 20th century was the most significant Jewish city, to Krakow, which played that role in the 16th century. As I mentioned already, huge numbers in Warsaw, and became a center. Jews were only allowed to live in the western side, the largest part of the city of Warsaw, early 19th century. And they're slower than in Western Europe, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks in Germany. When we visit Germany, Berlin, I should say, the process of enlightenment and acculturation and integration was slower in coming in Eastern Europe. Almost everything was destroyed, as I said, except for the cemetery, that one synagogue, and a number of memorials. And in many ways, I think one of the themes that I touch upon extensively in the few days that I'm usually with a group in Warsaw is this notion of this absence of presence. Here was a city that was as Jewish as any city in the world except for New York. And all of a sudden, there is nothing there. There's just no presence of Jews. You can't really walk and see anything Jewish per se, which is fundamentally different from what one experiences in Krakow, which 400 years before had been a Jewish center, largely crystallized around, and many of you might not have been to Poland, but have probably been to Prague. There was a lot of connection between Prague and Poland, and the RAMA, and the benefactor of the synagogue in Prague. And many of the synagogues in Prague had a connection to the Polish story in Krakow. They're not that far apart, of course, but Rabbi Moses Isserles, as he's known by his acronym, the RAMA, wrote a book called the Mapa, which is the tablecloth, which was in sync with the Sephardic written Shulchan Aruch, the set table that was written in Tzfat in the land of Israel in the same time, a great rabbi. And on his tombstone, it says, Mi Moshe la Moshe, from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses, which should have been copyrighted by Maimonides because they wrote that on his grave in Tiberias in the land of Israel too. From Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. But it gives you a sense. People might not have ever heard of him until they get there, but this was an unbelievable rabbinic authority in Europe, the rabbinic authority in Europe in the 16th century. And in sharp contrast to Warsaw, there are 7 synagogues that survived in a Jewish neighborhood called Kazimierz, a city which was 25% Krakow Jewish in contrast to Warsaw, but yet there was a number who survived, but the building survived. And that's why if I talk about the absence of presence in Warsaw, I talk about the presence of absence in Krakow. There is a palpable sense that something is missing because the synagogues are there, but there's not a lot of Jewish life there. So when one goes to Krakow, one needs to realize that the map, on that map that we're on our train for our 2.5 hours, and we're going from Warsaw here down to Krakow. But you look in Poland in the 16th century, it was the duchy, it was a combination of Poland, Lithuania, and parts of Russia today. And Belarusia up over here was a much larger, it was the pink, all of this pink over here, and all of the yellow down over there. If we look at Poland in the 18th century, Poland was divided 3 times from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from the Prussians, from the Russians, and there was really nothing of Poland until it became independent once again in 1919. So again, if our family came from, quote, Poland in 1919, it might have been from Krakow, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If it was Warsaw, it was part of Russia at the time. The borders changed significantly, and I want to make that point clear throughout. These are images from the cemetery and from the synagogue of Rabbi Moses Isserles, the RAMA in Krakow. The stones survived over 400 years, little notes the pilgrims put there. And the synagogue, I'll show you a color picture in a few minutes, is there. It's an active Orthodox synagogue. It's controlled, as the other 6 are, by the Polish Jewish community, the Krakow Jewish community called the Gemeina. And of course, it was property that survived post-Holocaust and was given by the Soviet communist government to the Jewish community to preserve. Of course, you weren't really allowed to have God under communism. So what did they do with it? Not a lot. And only in recent years, you can see the ceiling of the RAMA. It's a black and white picture one of my tourists took on the right. It's a picture from my iPhone on the left-hand side of the beautiful restored synagogue. And it survives because people like us, Jewish visitors or non-Jewish visitors, pay an admission fee to visit. Go through the arch on the right, go into the cemetery in the back, and then go into this kind of fortress-like, with literally, I mean, it is a fortress built by Rabbi Moses Isserles' father, 16th century synagogue that had been damaged and was fixed up. But of course, most of the structure is still there. Around the corner on the other side of this kind of Prague-like neighborhood called Kazimierz, which is named, by the way, after the Polish King Casimir, who had a Jewish wife / girlfriend / significant other whose name was Esther, who ultimately saved the Jews. Sounds a little bit like another story that we read every single Purim. At the far side of this active RAMA synagogue is the Alteshule, the oldest synagogue built 15th, 16th century in a series of periods. And today it's a museum that I don't spend a lot of time with my groups there because it's a museum largely for non-Jews. The majority of people who visit there are Polish and then German after that and probably Russian. And for them, they're going to a place where they see 7 synagogues, but they don't really see a fabric of contemporary Jewish life. It's there, but they don't really see it. It's small. It's not 65,000 Jews as it was 80 years ago. And they go through this museum, which chronicles Judaism and the Jewish story. You know, what is the calendar of Jewish tradition, who used to live there, etc. And on the far extreme, in every sense of the word, of the area of Kazimierz, literally outside of the square. So six synagogues, or 5 synagogues actually, are right in the square. And then a little bit further are 2 synagogues. And the furthest is this one on the right called the Tempel Synagogue. Look at it. Built in 1859, 1860, about the same time as New York City Central Synagogue, the Reform Synagogue, 1872, the Doheny Synagogue in Budapest. I've been to many, many times, built in 1860 next to where Theodor Herzl was born. The Orienberger Strasse Synagogue we'll see together in a few weeks in Berlin. This kind of neo-Islamic style of architecture, neo-Moorish style of architecture. It is Orthodox, but Reform, lowercase Orthodox. So you've got an Ezrat Nashim, a women's section on the right, on the left. You've got a place, you'll see it in a picture of a group that I had behind the bima, where there would have been a choir, there would have been an organ. And the founder of this community was a guy named Onias Ton, who was a member of the Polish parliament and was a representative of Polish Jewry at the earliest Zionist congresses in late 1800s, early 19th century. So it was very different than the image that we have of an ultra-Orthodox Jewish life, because not everybody there was ultra-Orthodox. These were academics. These were people well integrated. You can see by the beauty of the renovated, of course, synagogue, not as big as the Tolmaki Street Synagogue in Warsaw, but a prominent shul that gave expression to this idea of enlightenment, being a part of this city when it was built, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, speaking German, very acculturated, beginning to be more and more integrated because of the influence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire here, more so than in Warsaw, further north on the map as we saw earlier. A real kind of sense of, we're going to use art with all sorts of stained glass windows and other things. We're going to keep our Judaism and begin to kind of evolve Judaism as Reform and conservative Judaism, as I mentioned earlier, emerged in Germany. I have this picture of a synagogue from Chicago. I'm not sure if that's where your sister is from, Susan, but I wanted to show you here the size of the synagogue, not huge, but significant enough. But you can see the Arona Kodesh, the ark, and behind it a place where a choir would have sat. You wouldn't have had that in any of the other synagogues inside of Krakow. About an hour and a quarter bus ride today, just west of Warsaw, was a city called Oświęcim. In Poland, it's taken me a few hundred times to somewhat authentically pronounce that. Although when I say outside, you immediately know I'm Canadian. It used to have a population that was more than 50% Jewish, and its name might derive from the Hebrew word ushpizin, which we just used in our sukkah. Unfortunately, we only had virtual guests in our sukkah. But ushpizin is a term that suggests the hospitality of this place at a very important crossroads by road, by train in Europe as well. And it's there where the Germans the Nazis took a First World War army camp, added a second story to it, and built Auschwitz, which was a concentration / prisoner / prison, whatever term you want to use, in 1940. It was only a year later that a little bit down the road, they started to build something called Auschwitz II. There were dozens of little camps in the area of Auschwitz, but Auschwitz II, also known as Birkenau, from the German of the name of the Polish village that was there. They destroyed 2 Polish farming villages, and they built this factory of death, which operated for about 2.5 years, in which there were about 1 million plus people murdered, the vast majority of whom were Jewish, and it finally was liberated on January 27th, 1945 by the Soviets. That is why International Holocaust Day, which many of us commemorate, is that date reflecting when Auschwitz was liberated. The war wasn't over yet. That had to happen until May 8th and 9th of 45. But in the Jewish tradition, we have another day called Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah U'Legvura, Memorial Day for Holocaust, the murder in Auschwitz, and heroism. Remember the picture from Warsaw? You had 2 sides of the same sculpture, the Jews going to their death and the Jews fighting back. The truth, of course, historically was the majority went to their death, clinging to the hope that they'll survive just another day until the hell in which they find themselves will eventually end. I'm looking at my clock. I'm perfect timing. I still got 6 minutes. The road to Auschwitz. I don't know how many of you have studied history, theology, but you could probably spend a good semester asking the question of how we got to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I'm taking a course now for tour guides over 2.5 weeks. And today, or yesterday, we just talked about the 1900-year tradition of the Church of teaching of contempt to Judaism, anti-Semitism. Read Constantine's Sword by James Carroll. Huge libraries have been written about this. And if you ask me, I don't know if we have time to talk about that. There's no question that the Shoah rests on 1900 years of Christian teaching of contempt toward Judaism. A lot to talk about and unpack, but not now. There are 2 main historical schools, though. The first school is called the intentionalists, historians, Israeli, American, Polish, German, who say that Hitler wanted to murder the Jews of Europe. It just took a matter of time until he kind of got to that point where he was actually able to implement it, right? He created a totalitarian dictatorship within a democratic system. He was given the keys to power. We'll talk more about this in Berlin. And then sometime in early 41, maybe even late 40, they came up with a final solution. And only when the Einsatzgruppen and the mobile killing squads go from Poland eastward to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all the way down from the Baltic and the North Sea to the Black Sea in the south, do they begin to intentionally murder then about 1.5 million to 2 million Jews. That's the intentional school. The second school is called the functional school, which essentially says, listen, Hitler wanted to blame the Jews. He was the scapegoat for them. But it took 8.5 years from when he got the keys of power in June 30th, 1933, until the intentional mass murder, June of 41. Why? Well, maybe every step along the way was this extra slippery slope that eventually descended down to Auschwitz. And if things would have turned out a little bit differently, maybe, whether it was Chamberlain in 38 or whether it was the rest of the world in 1939 stopping Hitler or declaring war on Germany, or people boycotting the Olympics in 1936, only then in January 42 did they convene the conference in Wannsee, which we'll visit in Berlin in a few weeks' time, to sign the document, cross the T's and dot the I's of the final solution. Most historians, it might surprise you to realize, are in camp two, are functionalists. Europeans, Americans, and Israelis. Almost all of them say they buy into theory number two. And I talk about this on the journey out to Auschwitz. How did we get there? It's not a yes or no answer. It's questions because even today, in the year 2020, when it seems that illiberal democracy is more popular in parts of the world, like in Europe, in Poland and in Hungary, for example, than liberal democracy. And the question is, how do we know if we're on that slippery slope that led to what happened in the Second World War in Auschwitz and dozens of other places across Europe? The iconic image many of you have seen and recognize, Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free, that was in the arch at the entrance to Auschwitz I, which was the concentration camp and the work camp. And you can see a second story added by Germans, by the Nazis in 1940. It's a copy. The original was stolen a few years ago, cut into pieces, and now there's a copy up there. There used to be an orchestra just on the right-hand side with the most talented Jewish musicians in the world playing this horrible music. And as Max Eisen, one of my mentors, and somebody, a Holocaust survivor who had been to Auschwitz with probably half a dozen times, maybe 8 times now, he says that every day, Max was a teenage boy who survived, obviously, was on a work detail outside of the camp. As he got closer and closer, the moment he heard the orchestra, he knew that he had survived another day. And of course, the image on the right-hand side, famous, tragic, that is still there. It wasn't destroyed, unlike Birkenau, 1.5 miles down the road, which the biggest Jewish cemetery in the world. Most of it was destroyed. The crematoria complexes, the 4 of them were destroyed by the Germans in the fall of 1944. And many of the barracks, the wood of the barracks or the bricks of the barracks were removed by Poles who after the war wanted to reclaim the area nearby and build their houses that the Nazis had destroyed. I cannot begin to describe the enormity of Birkenau. It takes about 20 minutes at a rapid pace to walk in from the entrance through that horrible, famous or iconic, tragic gate on the right-hand side, all the way to where I'm standing, where I took this picture. You can't even see, they kind of see the tower just above the arrow over there. It's, I don't know, 3/4 of a mile long. It's massive. It is huge. I think 2.3 square miles. And in here is where the majority of 1.1 million people were killed. And perhaps the most important imagery we have of that is an album, a photo album taken by a German soldier of about 198 pictures taken in the spring of 1944 of Hungarian Jews just off the train on the right-hand side, being sent to be murdered, and a horrible picture on the left of this young girl eating food, maybe given from her mother or grandmother. On the right, we see with their Star of David, clearly Jewish, waiting outside the gas chambers where they're about to be murdered. And again, I don't want to spend that much time talking about Auschwitz. It's so much a part of our understanding, I think, of what Jewish life was like. And hopefully the 45 minutes of the hour that I'm talking to you today is going to focus a lot more on Jewish life that was, and in the last slides of Jewish life that still is. Every trip that I have doesn't end at Auschwitz, but ends back in Warsaw and Krakow, where we hopefully have a chance to meet the Jewish community and this Jewish Community Center. The first time I knew about this was about 11 years ago, when it just opened. And there was a sign on the wall somewhere behind that tree over there that says the Jewish Community Center, dedicated by HRH, His Royal Highness, the Duke of the Prince of Wales. And I got there before my group, a day before my group, and I'm walking around Krakow and I hear these sirens of police cars and convoys of police cars. And that night on Sky News on my hotel room, I saw Prince Charles and Camilla have come to dedicate the JCC in Warsaw. And the next day I meet my group and I come off the the plane and we start walking around the synagogues. This on the left, for example, is the backside where the bima of the Temple Synagogue. And I'm saying to my group, this is it. This is the new JCC, Derek. And like, what's the JCC doing here? And then I hear a voice saying to me, that's a good question. And it turns out it's Jonathan Ornstein, who we'll meet in a minute, at the Jewish Community Center. I said, Jonathan, who is this? Pleased to meet you. Of course, because I'd never met him. I said, who is the synagogue for? And he said, well, it's for the Jewish community of Krakow. And at the time, it was mostly 100 or 200 Jewish Holocaust survivors. But here's a short little movie I just found the other day of Jonathan Ornstein speaking to you about.
Jewish communities around the world are made up of many interlocking pieces: JCCs, federations, synagogues, Jewish family services, Hillels, BBYO, Jewish preschools, kosher restaurants, and many more. In Krakow, our Jewish community also has many components, and all of those pieces are called JCC Krakow.
BBYO.
Hillel.
Krakow. Synagogue.
Choir.
Jewish education.
Kosher catering.
Hebrew classes.
Visitor services.
By supporting JCC Krakow, you're supporting an entire Jewish community and all the pieces that make it up, from Holocaust survivors like my friend Zosha to the little children in our preschool. So please, help us continue to rebuild Jewish life in Krakow.
So I've been many times to Poland. I've had opportunity of meeting Jonathan many, many times. Zosha I've heard sing many times, and I don't want you to think that I want you to support the JCC in Krakow, but I do want to say, when I see somebody makes a comment about that, is that, as I said at the beginning, you know, a trip to Europe, as I said, is about, where's that coming? A trip to Europe, there it is a Jewish trip to Europe, again, is about understanding the present, but it's also about understanding the past. The understanding, I think, sorry about that. Hold it. I'm going to stop that.
Services, Hillels, BBYO, Jewish preschools.
I don't know why I keep having the video going on. Uh-oh. Sorry about that. Anyway, but my point is, hopefully you can hear me over that. I don't know if you can. I'm going to stop sharing. So I don't know if you can hear me because I have the music going on in the background. Good, thank you, Dana. But my point about the Jewish trip there, and then I'm going to open up the questions, is that the idea of a trip to that part of the world is not just about seeing the Shoah, but it's really understanding the rich life that was beforehand. Because as Joni Mitchell, a fellow Canadian, said in that beautiful song, that as Joni Mitchell said, stop, thank you. As Joni Mitchell said in that famous song, Big Yellow Taxi, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? In other words, how can we possibly mourn Jewish life unless we can understand what was there beforehand? And how can we possibly celebrate Jewish life if we can't understand what is there today? So I'm not going to suggest that we are in the midst of a Jewish Renaissance. because 5,000, maybe 10,000 people in the Jewish community is not 3.5 million, but as 3.25 million. But as Michael Schudrick, the rabbi in the synagogue in Warsaw, says the following. He says, listen, somebody says, Rabbi, how many Jews are there in Poland? He says, let me tell you a story. And he tells a story about a young woman who a week before had come into his office, said, Rabbi, I don't know what to do, because last week my grandmother passed away, and she said to me, and only me, not to my mother, not to my father, not to my sibling, my brother, but to me, that the reason we didn't celebrate Easter and the reason that we didn't have a Christmas tree and we ate special crackers around Easter time was because I was Jewish, but I didn't tell anybody. Because the grandmother had experienced the trauma of the Shoah, had experienced 5 decades of the trauma of communism, didn't want to say it to anybody. So Rabbi Schudrick says, I don't know how many Jews there are in Poland today, but I will tell you, today there are more Jews in Poland than there were yesterday. I see a couple of questions here. Good, you can hear me. Somebody asked me about anti-Semitism in Poland. Look, the amazing thing is that you can have anti-Semitism even in places where there aren't Jews. We have that in America, crazily enough, in places, you don't just have anti-Semitism in big communities, but in other places where there aren't that many Jews. And you, of course, have that in Poland today. There is a very anti-Semitic radio station in Poland today. But that being said, Poland and Israel have strong diplomatic relations, strong political relations, strong military relations, even if the Polish government might not necessarily be in sync with the way most liberal Israelis or liberal American Jews think of things. It's definitely a different reality today. A couple of years ago, there was a Polish law that was passed that said it made it illegal and could lead to incarceration, to a jail term, a fine and a jail term. If anybody used the word Polish death camps, I never used them because I think President Obama had made that slip of tongue while he was in Europe, while he was in Poland, actually. And they're not Polish death camps. They're death camps, they're Nazi German death camps built in Poland. But they were not Polish death camps. And the Poles suffered tremendously at the hands of the Germans, right? There were 6 million Poles killed in the war, half of whom were killed by, as Jews in the Shoah, and 500,000 killed as Poles, whether it was in Polish resistance. The longest resistance of any country in Europe was Poland, much longer than France, for example. And so you've got the story of a complicated period where there were many Poles who were willing collaborators with Nazis in killing Jews. But on the other hand, you've got the largest number of the righteous amongst the nations, people recognized by Yad Vashem in Israel as having risked their lives, deriving no material benefit for saving Jews. Right? Irina's Children is another book you might have read about this woman, Irina Sendler, a social worker who saves thousands, over 2,500 Jewish children, her and a group of colleagues, literally smuggling children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Or the family that saved Jews through the zoo, right? The Zookeeper's Wife, the book, and then the movie that came out a few years ago. There are thousands of stories that we know of, and God knows how many we don't know of Poles saving Jews. So I would never say that Poland is anti-Semitic. I would say that there are anti-Semites in Poland, just as I can't say that America is anti-Semitic, but I know that there are anti-Semites in America. And although I grew up in a home where my grandparents and grandmother said that, oh, all that part of the world, they're all weaned on the blood of anti-Semitism. I'll tell you one more story which illustrates, I think, a little bit of how I feel in 25 years since the mid-90s coming to Poland different. And that's this story. When I first went to the Polish Museum when it opened, I guess 8 or 9 years ago in Warsaw, my opening slide, I bought the Los Angeles City phone book sized book of the museum. I mean, I had to get a new coffee table. It's so heavy, literally, it's massive. And I was checking in that night or the next day to my flight back to Tel Aviv with my group. And at El Al Security was a man, and he asked me, he sees my book. I couldn't put it in my suitcase because my suitcase would have been overweight. It literally was like 5 or 10 pounds. So he says, oh, I see you've been in the museum. How was it? So I tell him about the museum. He said, have you gone? He says, no. I said, oh, you work for El Al. Are you Jewish? No, not Jewish, not Israeli. He says, but the museum sounds very interesting. I have friends who went. I really, really, really want to go. Fast forward 2, maybe 3 years. And I'm sitting in, waiting for my group to land in Poland, again, from Toronto, another group a couple years later. And I'm sitting there having my coffee at 7:30 in the morning. I'm drinking, half asleep. And I see this guy walking by and we establish eye contact. We look at each other and I realized who it was. My wife says, I never forget a face. I didn't forget this guy. It was that Polish security guard from El Al. I said, hey, you remember me? He said, yeah, the museum. I said, did you go? He said, I've been twice. When it opened, I went 2 times because it's so amazing. There's so much to understand about Jewish life in Poland, that me as a Pole, I need to understand that relationship and that period to understand my identity as a Pole. And Poles and Jews were such an important part of the Polish fabric, as we'll see in Germany later, as we'll see in Russia later as well, and Spain, that you can't just look through the prism of persecution, humiliation, expulsion, anti-Semitism. It's a complicated 1,000 years. And I don't suggest intellectually in 70 minutes, 65 minutes that I've been teaching you, that we know it all. Far from it. We haven't even scraped the tip of the iceberg, but it's complicated, good times. You don't have a golden era in the 16th century in Krakow unless things are good. And one could argue at that time, that was perhaps the best place in the world to be as a Jew. The worst place in the world from 1939 to 45, but the best place in the 16th century. See if I get any more questions here. Please. Somebody asked about Galicia. Good. Well, as I kind of said, many of us from that part of the world are either Litvaks or Galicianers, which is a geographic reference. You might also say a Litvak is a misnaged, and a Galicianer is a Chassid. Hasidism emerges in the late 18th century, early 19th century, in a geographic region called Galicia, which was a province then of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Today, that geographic area is divided between Poland, Ukraine, a little bit of, I think it touched on Slovakia and Hungary, if I'm not mistaken. And that is where this idea of following of a Rebbe, think of the Lubavitcher Rebbe or the Zanz Rebbe, Ger, etc. Whereas in Vilnius, by the followers of the Vilna Gaon, the greatest kind of Talmudic sage at that time, late 18th, early 19th century, excommunicated the Hasidim from Judaism. It lasted a short period, but that's how deep the gap was back then, 200 years ago in Europe. And oftentimes we use the kind of derogatory term, I will say, oh, you shouldn't have married him. I knew it all along. He was just a Galicianer. You, on the other hand, are Litvak. You come from a long line of, Talmudic scholars. It's like you got an Ivy League education and they couldn't even finish, community college type of thing. And don't go to them there. That is kind of the tension between the Litvaks and the Galicianers. Today, in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, there is still the separation or the division between the Lithuanian world and the Hasidic world, largely Chabad abroad, but here, Ger and Zanz and dozens of other Hasidic groupings. Okay, what else do I see in other questions here? Good question. Somebody asked if I want to learn about shtetl life in Poland. Well, again, shtetl life wasn't just in Galicia, it was all over, but there's a museum, I didn't even talk about it because I only had an hour, called the Galicia Museum. Google Galicia Museum Krakow. And it's an amazing museum in an old warehouse that is made up of photographs taken by a man who, since deceased, from England, called Chris Schwartz. Now, one of his parents was Jewish, I'm guessing the father, and the mother, I'm guessing through the Chris, was Christian. And Chris Schwartz went on his own personal journey through this geographic region of Galicia, and he created a book. I think it's, I forget its name now, Memories of Galicia, I don't remember its name. It's a photo book, and he basically looks at physical fragments. Maybe it is a stone that is used on pavement that was that had been a matzeva, or a memorial to where Jews were murdered in Galicia by the Einsatzgruppen in the summer and fall of 1941. Fragments of Memory, that's it. Google Fragments of Memory, Chris Schwartz, and it's an important book of the visual record of how, as I said earlier, the presence of absence. There's just nothing there, maybe a little sign of Jewish life that had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I don't know, check the website, the Galicia Museum in Krakow, because Krakow is the edge of Galicia. Lomza, I do not know Lomza. There were over 1,000 Jewish communities. I'm in that part of the world, and my acquaintance is limited to the majority of the bigger communities. Do I see one more Q&A here? What about the current political center? I've answered that one. Good. Other questions, please do not hesitate.
There was a question early on from someone about how did the Jews get, after the destruction of the temple, how did Jews get to Eastern Europe? What was the migration pattern?
The short answer is by boat, but all kidding aside, there were Jews across the Mediterranean basin even before the destruction of the temple. We know centuries before, in the Hellenistic period, so the Greek period, which predates the Roman period, so 4th century before the Common Era, Alexander the Great comes to the land of Israel in 332 BCE, right? But what happens is there are already Jews living in Alexandria. There already was a thriving diaspora at that point. So think of Egypt today, think of Tunisia and Libya today. There were Jews there that eventually got up in the 7th century into Muslim conquering Spain, which we'll talk about eventually. But there were Jews throughout the kind of the southern part of the Mediterranean and the northern part of the Mediterranean. We would call the Ottoman Empire, Greece, Turkey of today, Italy, of course, of today, already before the destruction of the temple, and more joined them post-destruction of the temple. It's estimated that at its height, Roman Empire was about 10% Jewish. So we know Jews already there at that point. And the amazing thing, of course, was that there, and we know the temple, the Jewish community in Rome has a tradition which is one of the oldest in the world. It's one of the, I think, the oldest diasporic traditions, which shows us that Jews were already living there already at even before the temple was destroyed.
So they just trade and travel and they just disperse throughout. Well, I want to thank you so much for this incredible, wonderful lecture. This is our first one. And next week we will be going to Russia. Is that correct?
I hope so. I'll be there. Somebody put up the website to the Ghetto Museum. Thank you. I don't know who did that, but thank you very, very much.
So thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. And we will see you next week.
Look, no, not next week, 2 weeks.
Oh, is it in 2 weeks?
It's in 2 weeks, yeah. We're doing, because we're doing
right.
not
in 2 weeks.
2 weeks and then 3 weeks and 4 weeks. Good.
Right, yes.
All right, stay safe and healthy.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom alitrat. And thank you all for the positive feedback.
Thank you so much. November 3rd, Russia, yes.
No, not November 3rd, November 10th.
Oh, November. Are you sure? You and I will have to communicate.
Okay.
You're right. I think it is November 10th. Yeah.
It's November 10th.
We're not doing it on voting day.
Yes.
It'd be too busy and too agitated.
Although it seems that everybody's already voted. 65 million people. That's good.
I voted. Yeah.
Good.
Well,
unlike Chicago, where they vote early and vote often. All right. I'll see you all in 2 weeks' time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks for coming. Bye.